sky over Manhattan tore like bad television reception. Static bled across the clouds, white noise in the blue, then collapsed inward, a wound stitched shut by nothing at all. People on the street never saw the seam close. They noticed only the thunder that followed, the way the air tasted of ozone and burnt copper, the flicker that turned every billboard on Times Square into a stuttering mess of pixels and screaming color. Cameras glitched, phones dropped calls. For half a heartbeat, the city forgot how to pretend it was in control. Loki fell out of that broken sky and landed on the crown of a glass tower that advertised heroes like detergent. He rose to his feet with a laugh that tasted like relief and rage. Gold and green armor caught the city's reflected lights. A horned helm shimmered into place, then dissolved again at a thought. His dagger sang softly in his hand, a familiar note in a universe that felt wrong. The currents of fate were coarse here, tangled with money and fear and the cheap perfume of spectacle. No Bifrost hum, no sacred geometry of Asgard's wards, only a crude gravity in the press of a billion eyes hungry for a story. Midgard, Loki murmured, and then corrected himself as the city answered with sirens instead of prayers. Not my Midgard. He reached inward, testing the weave. His magic answered, obedient, sharp, but it slid along a surface varnished with something synthetic. The power here had been injected, not earned, forced into flesh by syringes and contracts. Compound V sang like a bad note under the skin of passing soups he could sense blocks away. Gods were born of myth. Monsters here were manufactured. A helicopter chopped the air. Another followed. Logos bloomed on their sides like heraldry stripped of honor. Vought International. Loki tasted the name as the rotors circled. Below, a crowd gathered because crowds always gathered. They lifted phones, not offerings. He smiled at that. A god did not need worship, only attention. He stepped off the tower and fell. Gasps tore through the street as his form split into a dozen Lokis, then 100, each laughing as gravity forgot them. The illusions collapsed into one a breath before impact. He landed lightly, boots kissing asphalt, shockwave cracking the pavement in a ring that flipped cars and sent people screaming. Loki straightened, hands spread, cloak billowing in a wind that had not existed a moment before. New York, he said, voice carrying without effort, resonant as a sermon. You have my curiosity. A woman in a cape streaked toward him, red, white, blue blur and practiced smile. Starlight slowed, eyes flaring as she took in the armor, the dagger, the way his grin did not belong to any script. Hey, she said, projecting warmth for the cameras already rolling. Let's keep this calm, okay? Vought can help. Loki's dagger flicked. Not at her, never waste a first move, but at the air between them. The illusions snapped into place. Screens around the square bloomed to life, hijacked feeds spilling images that had never been meant for daylight. A back alley, a body, blood rinsed down a drain. The smile on Starlight's face froze as the crowd gasped, then roared. Careful, Loki told her gently. This world eats its young. Something heavy landed behind him. The ground complained. Homelander's boots sank an inch into asphalt. The man's smile was blinding, perfect, empty. Heat shimmered at his eyes like a promise. You're making a mess, Homelander said. That's my job. Loki turned, eyes alight. Here was power, real, feral, wrapped in patriotism and insecurity. A king with no crown who would burn the throne rather than share it. Delicious. You mistake me, Loki replied. I am making a point. Homelander moved faster than sound, fist cracking against Loki's jaw. The blow launched him through a bus and into a storefront. Glass rained. Loki rolled, came up laughing, blood at the corner of his mouth already knitting closed. He had felt the punch. He had not been broken.
The crowd screamed louder, cameras loved it. Homelander hovered, eyes narrowing. "What are you?" Loki wiped his lip. "A god," he said, and the word rang truer than anything on a contract. "And you are a very loud boy in a very small kingdom." Heat vision flared. Loki vanished, reappearing above, then behind, then everywhere at once. Homelander's beams carved illusions into smoke. A semi flipped. Someone died. The sound of it rippled through the square like a dropped plate in a cathedral. Loki felt it, the weight of consequence, the way this world punished spectacle with collateral. He let the illusions fall. He stepped back, hands raised. "Enough," he said, and meant it. "I do not rule ruins." Sirens wailed closer. Vought's helicopters tightened their circle. Snipers took positions. The chessboard filled with pieces that thought they were kings. Homelander landed, chest heaving, smile fixed too tight. "You don't get to choose when it's enough." Loki's eyes flicked to the screen, still looping blood and secrets. "You already did." Silence followed. Not peace, but the held breath before a storm. Loki bowed with theatrical flourish, then vanished in a ripple of green light that tasted of mischief and warning. He reappeared miles away atop a derelict church. The city stretched beneath him like a map of veins and neon. Below, the feeds went wild. The name Loki trended in 1,000 spellings. Vought's crisis team screamed into headsets. Somewhere in a dark room, a man with cold eyes smiled and adjusted a plan. Loki breathed in the city. He felt its sickness and its strength, its addiction to lies. He felt the pull of 100 paths, and for the first time in a long while, the trickster god felt something like anticipation untainted by prophecy. If you want to see more characters enter this universe, hit that subscribe button and drop a character name in the comments.
Loki learned quickly that this universe worshipped not gods, but narratives. From the skeletal bell tower of the abandoned church, he watched the city metabolize him. News vans swarmed the cratered square he'd left behind. Commentators argued over whether he was a soup, a hoax, or a foreign weapon. Think pieces bloomed within hours. The God problem, mythology is terrorism. Is Loki cancelled already? Hashtags rose and fell like mayflies. The speed of it was almost admirable. In Asgard, belief was carved into stone and song. Here, belief was rented by the minute. Loki smiled. He peeled back the layers of the city with magic that moved like thought. Cameras were everywhere, eyes without souls, but they could be blinded, coaxed, convinced. He listened to police bands and private channels with equal ease. Vaught's internal frequencies were wrapped in encryption that would have impressed a lesser sorcerer. Loki slipped through it like a rumor through a crowd. Stan Edgar's voice emerged from the static, calm, measured, utterly unafraid. "We don't escalate," Edgar said. "We contextualize. Gods test well with faith demographics. Fear tests even better." Loki tilted his head. "Oh, you magnificent little spider," he murmured. He conjured a mirror and watched himself. Not the armor, not the crown, but the man beneath. He had arrived whole, no leash, no TVA pruning baton humming at his spine. The temptation to burn this world down flared hot and familiar. It would be easy. A few illusions, a few truths loosed at the right time, and the tower would fall. But then what? Below the church, a group moved through the shadows with military efficiency, not bothering to hide from cameras they knew were blind. Loki felt them before he saw them, unaugmented humans carrying weapons that smelled of desperation and stubbornness. One man walked at their center like a scar that refused to fade.
Billy Butcher looked up and met Loki's gaze as if daring the universe to blink first. Loki appeared behind him without ceremony. "Careful," Loki said conversationally. "You'll strain something craning like that." Guns came up, fingers tightened. Butcher didn't turn. He smiled, slow and mean. "Told you he'd be a ponce," he said to no one in particular. "Big entrance, shiny shoes." Loki examined him with interest. No compound V in his blood, yet, but rage lived in him like a second heart. Purpose, too, not the clean kind, the useful kind. "You hunt monsters, but you dress like one to feel brave." Butcher finally turned, eyes flinty. "And you're not a monster?" Loki considered. "I am a professional disappointment."
Butcher snorted despite himself. "Right, here's how this goes. You help us crack Vought open, or we put you down like the rest of them." Loki laughed. The sound startled birds from the church rafters. "Oh, please, you couldn't put me down with a god killer and a prayer." "But we can make your life inconvenient," Butcher replied, "and you look like a bloke who hates inconvenience." Fair. They talked, not as allies, not as friends, but as predators circling the same herd. Loki learned of the boys, of blackmail and broken promises, of a war fought in alleyways and boardrooms. Butcher learned that Loki could peel secrets from a city without touching it, and that he would not be owned. "You don't kneel," Butcher said finally. "No," Loki agreed, "but I bargain." Their truce was ugly and temporary, and exactly what this world produced best. Vought moved next. A blonde woman with practiced confidence appeared on Loki's hijacked feeds that night, framed by soft lighting and concern. Madeline Stillwell spoke of safety and collaboration. She invited Loki to talk. She promised transparency with the ease of a lie told 1,000 times. Loki declined by replacing her broadcast mid-sentence. The image shifted to a Vought lab, men in coats, children crying, a syringe glinting under harsh light. "Power," Loki said gently over the feed, "should never be sold like candy. It rots the teeth." Panic rippled, stocks dipped, lawyers screamed. Homelander watched from a penthouse, jaw tight, nails digging crescents into his palm. He had been hurt. Not in body, though the ache lingered, but in story. Someone had stepped into his spotlight and refused to die. "Find him," Homelander growled. They tried. Black Ops teams vanished into illusions that walked them in circles until dawn. A-Train hit a wall that hadn't been there a moment before and spent a week in traction. A sniper swore his rifle had turned into a snake. Loki was careful. He hurt no one who didn't choose to be there. The distinction mattered to him more than he liked to admit. On the 5th night, Homelander found him anyway, hovering above a river of traffic, neon bleeding across his armor. "You think you're better than me," Homelander said, voice trembling beneath the smile. Loki looked at him, truly looked. The loneliness, the hunger, the leash disguised as adoration. "No," Loki said softly. "I think you are what happens when a world confuses strength with love." Homelander screamed and charged. They fought above the city like colliding myths. Loki's illusions bent light and probability. Homelander's fists bent steel and certainty. Loki cut him, once, twice, enough to draw blood and shock the watching world into silence. Homelander threw him through a billboard and into the river. Loki rose again, dripping, laughing, magic flaring bright. But every blow cracked something below. A bridge buckled, cars fell, people died. Loki felt it like a bruise on his soul. He vanished before the killing blow, leaving Homelander roaring at the sky. Later, alone,
Loki sat on a rooftop and stared at his hands. Power without wisdom was a child with a weapon. He had been that child. He would not be again. He made his choice then, not to rule, not to destroy, but to unmake the lie. The next morning, the world woke to truth cascading like dominoes. Contracts leaked, surveillance feeds surfaced, payoffs, murders, experiments laid bare with surgical precision. Not chaos, exposure. Vought reeled. Stan Edgar watched the screens and nodded once. Interesting, very interesting, he said. Loki stood unseen in the control room, smiling thinly. The game had changed.
Vought did not panic. That, more than anything, unsettled Loki. Panic was honest. Panic meant fear had found a crack. What Vought did instead was adapt. Press releases sharpened, executives vanished behind shell companies, lawyers moved faster than truth. The leaks, his leaks, were framed as deepfakes, foreign interference, performance art. The narrative bent, not broke. Loki watched it happen from a luxury penthouse that did not officially exist. He had stolen it with a signature and a smile, convincing 3 separate owners they'd always meant to donate it to a shell charity that now paid its rent in illusions. The city glittered below him, indifferent as ever. "So that's the trick," Loki muttered. "You don't deny reality, you drown it." He felt a ripple before he saw it, a tightening in the weave, a pressure like hands closing around a throat. This world was pushing back, not with magic, but with systems. Algorithms adjusted, feeds buried his truths under outrage cycles and celebrity scandals. Attention drifted, belief wavered. Godhood, Loki realized, was fragile here. A door opened behind him without a knock. Butcher walked in, coat still damp from rain, expression set to barely tolerating this nonsense. "Congrats," Butcher said. "You rattled the cage." "And?" Loki replied. "And the rats learned to bite." Butcher tossed a tablet on the glass table. Footage played, a warehouse raid gone wrong. Black uniformed men moving with military precision. Not Vought security, something cleaner, something colder. "New division," Butcher said. "Off books, no soups, just humans with toys and permission." Loki leaned forward, interest piqued. "Ah, adaptation. They're calling it Project Aegis. Anti-soup, anti-you. You're the proof of concept." On the screen, a man raised a weapon that hummed with a frequency Loki felt in his teeth. The blast didn't kill its target, a low-tier soup, but it dropped him screaming, nervous system shorting like a blown fuse. Loki's smile faded. That frequency scratched at something deeper than flesh. Not magic, but interference. Crude, brutal, effective. "Clever," Loki said quietly. "They are learning how to hurt gods without believing in them." Butcher studied him. "You bleeding?" "Not yet," Loki replied, "but I would prefer to keep it that way." They moved that night. The warehouse sat on the edge of the river, concrete and sodium lights, the kind of place the city pretended not to see. Loki wrapped the area in a glamour that bent cameras and luck alike. Inside, the boys slipped through shadows, human and breakable and furious. Loki did not lead, he orchestrated. Doors unlocked themselves. Guards saw reflections where none existed. A man chased a sound down a corridor and met his own fear wearing his face. Loki tasted the hum of Aegis tech and threaded his magic around it, not against it, sliding between the notes instead of clashing head-on. Then something went wrong. A pulse rippled through the building, sharp and invasive. Loki staggered as if struck, vision blurring, magic stuttering. For a terrifying instant, the world felt flat, his illusions collapsing into nothing. He laughed breathlessly. "Oh, that is rude." From the control room, a woman watched him through reinforced glass. She was not smiling. She was not afraid. Her eyes tracked data, not drama. Grace Mallory. "You're not a god," she said over the intercom. "You're a variable." Loki straightened slowly, power coiling back into place as the pulse faded. "And you," he replied, "are terribly unimaginative." Mallory didn't rise to the bait. "We don't need to kill you. We just need to make you irrelevant." She triggered the system again. This time, Loki felt it tear at him. Not enough to stop him, but enough to cost him. Energy bled off like heat into a vacuum. His illusions wavered. His focus narrowed. This was one of the rules he knew well. Power always had a price, and someone here had finally learned how to charge it. Butcher's voice crackled in his ear. "We're pinned." Loki closed his eyes for half a heartbeat and chose restraint, a choice that surprised even him. He could have burned the place down. He could have killed everyone inside. Instead, he folded reality like a card trick, swapping positions, misdirecting momentum, letting the system overload itself, chasing ghosts. The Aegis generators screamed, lights blew, Mallory's screen went dark. They escaped into the night with seconds to spare. On a rooftop miles away, Loki sat heavily, armor dimmer than before, breath coming just a little too fast. Butcher watched him. "You held back." "Yes, and I hate that you noticed." Butcher shrugged. "Means you're learning." Loki wiped sweat from his brow, fingers faintly trembling. He hated that too. Elsewhere, Homelander stood in a white room that smelled of antiseptic and betrayal. Scientists avoided his gaze. The footage played again. Loki cutting him, Loki leaving, Loki winning without kneeling. "They're scared of him," Homelander said softly. No one answered. Homelander's smile returned, sharper now. "Good. Because if gods could bleed, if they could be contained, then maybe kings could be replaced." High above, Loki watched the city and felt something new settle into his bones. This world would not be conquered by thunder or crowns. It would be won or lost by control. The city began to lie about Loki. At first, it was subtle. Late-night hosts joked about the cosplayer with delusions. Morning panels argued whether the green-clad figure had ever existed at all. Vought-funded psychologists appeared on cable news, explaining how mass hysteria and deep-fake tech could fabricate gods out of algorithmic noise. The narrative didn't confront Loki. It erased him. Loki felt it, like suffocation. Belief was thinning, attention slipping. His magic still answered, but slower now, like a blade dulled by neglect. Not gone, never gone, but taxed. This was not a world where gods were slain by swords. They were buried under content. "Insidious," Loki muttered from the shadows of a half-finished skyscraper. Steel beams framed the skyline like ribs. I should have expected nothing less. Below, a protest surged. Anti-soup signs, anti-Vought chants, righteous anger colliding with riot police. Loki sensed the fault lines. Humans furious at gods, gods terrified of losing relevance, corporations tightening their grip. He could tip it. One illusion, one spark. He didn't, because someone else already had. The explosion wasn't large, but it was perfect. A Vought humanitarian transport reduced to a smoking shell. Bodies arranged just messily enough to be blamed on soups. The footage went live within minutes. The message was clear. This is what happens when you lose control. Loki's jaw tightened. "That wasn't you," he said aloud, though no one stood beside him. Homelander hovered over the wreckage moments later, cape fluttering, face carved into grief for the cameras. Loki tasted the lie immediately. The king had learned a new trick, martyrdom, and the world ate it up. Later, in a safe house that smelled of stale coffee and gun oil, the boys watched the fallout in silence. Even Butcher looked grim. "That blast," Huey said, "it wasn't soups, it was military grade." "False flag, a classic." Mother's Milk glanced at him. "You sound impressed." "I am. It takes discipline to weaponize tragedy without believing your own story." Butcher leaned forward. "So, what's the play, Goldilocks? You gonna magic us a miracle?" Loki closed his eyes, feeling the strain in his core where ages' pulses had scraped him raw. He could force the issue, go big, go loud, but it would cost him more than he was willing to pay. Not power, direction. "No," Loki said finally, "we change the board." That night, he walked into Vought Tower openly. No illusions, no theatrics, just a man in a tailored green suit, horns absent, expression calm. Security froze as he passed, recognition lagging behind disbelief. By the time anyone thought to stop him, he was already in the executive elevator. Stan Edgar waited for him. "You should have knocked," Stan Edgar said mildly. Loki studied the man. No fear, no awe, just calculation. "You invited me the moment you decided not to kill me." Edgar smiled thinly. "I wanted to see if you'd figure that out." They spoke like equals, not because they were, but because both refused to pretend otherwise. Edgar offered containment without cages, influence without crowns, a place in the system, a god properly branded. "You don't need worship," Edgar said. "You need relevance." Loki considered the offer longer than he should have. Then he laughed. "I have been relevant since before your species learned to lie politely," Loki said, "and I will not be filed under assets." Edgar nodded, unsurprised. "Then you'll lose." "Perhaps," replied Loki, "but not alone." When Loki vanished, the tower's lights flickered, not out, just enough to remind everyone inside that something older than money had walked its halls. Across the city, Homelander felt it and clenched his fists. This was no longer about Vought. This was about who got to define godhood.
The first time Loki truly lost, no one saw it happen. There was no battle, no explosion, no viral clip. Just a quiet absence where something important had been. He noticed it while weaving a minor glamour over a subway line, nothing dramatic, just a nudge to delay a train and spare a man from an argument that would have turned violent. The spells slipped, not failed, thinned, like pulling silk through fingers numb from cold. Loki frowned. He reached deeper. Power answered, but reluctantly, like a favor asked too often. The city's disbelief pressed in on him, an invisible weight. It wasn't that people denied gods existed, it was worse. They didn't care. That night, Vought launched Dawn of Seven, a rebrand, new costumes, new origin stories, a redemption arc so polished it reflected light. Homelander stood at the center of it all, tearful, restrained, repentant, every inch the humbled savior. The explosion was blamed on extremists. The leaks were reframed as manipulation by an unverified extra-normal entity. Loki's image appeared on screens everywhere, distorted, slowed, scored with ominous music, the trickster threat, foreign god or fraud. The lie was elegant, belief hemorrhaged. Loki retreated to places the city forgot, abandoned theaters, flooded basements, server farms humming like mechanical hives. He fed on scraps of attention, whispers in comment sections, conspiracy forums arguing whether he was real. It was enough to survive, not enough to win. "You're starving," Butcher said one evening, tossing him a bottle he didn't need. "I am adapting," Loki replied. Butcher snorted. Same thing people say right before they break. Loki didn't answer. He was too busy feeling something coil around his magic, something human and methodical. Project Aegis had expanded. Not just weapons now, but protocols, rituals without mysticism, frequencies tuned to interfere with extra-dimensional coherence. They were learning how to erase him without ever touching a blade. The next confrontation came on Vought's terms. Homelander called him out, openly, publicly, hovering over a stadium packed with cheering bodies and corporate banners. He spoke of accountability, of standing up to bullies, of protecting humanity from pretenders. Loki appeared in the stands, cloaked, watching. He could feel the trap. Aegis emitters woven into the infrastructure, drones tuned to his resonance, cameras everywhere, hungry. Homelander descended into the field like a god returning home. "Come on out, Loki," Homelander called, smiling wide. "Let's show them who you really are." The crowd chanted Homelander's name, not Loki's. Loki stepped into view anyway. The noise dipped, confusion, curiosity, but it did not swell. No awe, no fear, just expectation.
Homelander struck first. The punch landed harder than before, not because Homelander was stronger, but because Loki was weaker. The Aegis field flared, draining heat and color from his magic. Loki skidded across turf, breath punched from his lungs. He rose, bloodied, grinning. "Is this your kingdom?" he asked. "A cheering cage?" Homelander's smile twitched. "It's mine." They clashed again. Loki's illusions flickered under the field's pressure. Each spell cost him more than it should have. He cut Homelander, deep enough to draw blood, and the crowd gasped. Then the emitters surged. Loki screamed as the world went thin and sharp. For a heartbeat, he was nowhere, between dimensions, unmoored. He felt something precious tear loose. Not his power, his anchor. He vanished before Homelander could finish it, collapsing in an alley miles away, shaking, gasping, armor gone, magic guttering like a dying flame. Butcher found him there. "You're fading," Butcher said quietly. "No," Loki rasped. "I am being edited." The realization settled heavy and cold. This world did not need to kill him, it only needed to forget him. Loki stared up at the polluted stars and made the most dangerous decision of his long life. If belief was the currency of gods, then he would stop trying to be one.
Loki disappeared from the sky. Not dramatically, not in a burst of green fire or laughter echoing across rooftops. He simply stopped being visible. No hijacked broadcasts, no calling cards, no rumors fed to conspiracy forums. The trickster god, once splashed across every screen, withdrew into the blind spots of a world that only noticed what demanded attention. And in that absence, he learned something new. The city breathed differently when he walked it as a man. No armor, no horns, no illusions layered over his face, just a tailored coat, dark hair tied back, eyes sharp and tired. He felt smaller, yes, but also denser, like a blade folded until it cut deeper for its size. His magic remained, banked and disciplined, used sparingly. Every spell now had intent, every lie had a cost. Belief no longer fed him, information did. He listened. Loki haunted places where stories were shaped before they became truths: PR firms, data centers, focus groups, marketing war rooms. He slipped into meetings as an intern no one remembered hiring, a consultant whose badge always worked, a man who asked the right question at exactly the wrong moment. Humans, he learned, were astonishingly easy to steer once you understood their incentives. Fear moved them faster than awe. Outrage faster than fear, profit faster than all of it. Vought understood this. That was why they were winning. So Loki stopped fighting Vought like a god and started hunting them like a liar. He mapped their arteries, shell companies feeding black budgets, subsidiaries laundering sins into philanthropy, think tanks seeding narratives months before crises occurred. He watched Project Aegis metastasize, not as a single program, but as a doctrine. Anti-soup training modules embedded in law enforcement, portable emitters disguised as infrastructure upgrades, the slow normalization of god-killing tools. They weren't building weapons, they were building permission. Loki felt the moral weight of it settle on him during a long night in a borrowed apartment overlooking Queens. Rain streaked the windows, sirens braided with distant laughter. Humanity was doing what it always did when frightened, sharpening knives and calling it safety. He could stop this, not by force, but by revelation. The question was whether he should. Billy Butcher re-entered his life with a bruise on his cheek and a look that said things had gotten worse. "They're coming for us," Butcher said, dropping into a chair without invitation. Not like before. Quiet. Legal. Loki poured 2 glasses of something human and bitter. They always were. MM's flagged 3 arrests, false charges, Huey's name's on a watch list. Butcher leaned forward. "And they're saying it's because of you." Loki's hand stilled. "They're using you," Butcher continued, "is proof the world needs a leash. You vanish, they win. You come back loud, they win faster." Loki exhaled slowly. "So, what do you suggest?" Butcher met his gaze. "You don't play God, you play accountant." Loki laughed beside himself. "I once stabbed my brother for a throne. Yeah, and now you're gonna audit the apocalypse." It was an ugly plan, inelegant, human. Loki loved it.
They didn't target Homelander first. That would have been too obvious, too cathartic. Instead, Loki began leaking boring truths, budget discrepancies, timeline inconsistencies, internal memos that contradicted public apologies. Nothing explosive, just enough to rot credibility from the inside. A charity lost donor confidence, a senator postponed a vote, a police department quietly shelved its new Aegis rollout. Death by 1,000 footnotes. Homelander noticed within days. He stood alone in the ruins of an old studio set, fists clenched, staring at a cracked mirror that reflected him in fragments. The applause had softened, the cheers had lost conviction. Even fear, his most reliable tool, was being diluted by skepticism. Someone was stealing his oxygen. "Find him," Homelander snarled. They tried. A-Train chased shadows that led him into traffic traps and dead ends. Black Noir vanished for 48 hours and returned without explanation, visor cracked, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. Aegis units tracked Loki's signature, only to find it split, refracted, hiding behind layers of mundane humanity. Loki wasn't masking himself with magic, he was hiding behind systems. The turning point came quietly, as all real collapses do. Vought prepared to unveil Phase 2 of Project Aegis at a closed-door summit. Military contractors, select world leaders, investors who preferred their wars deniable. Loki obtained the guest list, the agenda, the security architecture. He hesitated. This was the moment. Expose it all, burn the lie down to bedrock. But if he did, if he revealed how close humanity was to institutionalized God-killing, panic would follow. Lynchings, preemptive strikes, the end of soups as a concept replaced by open season. Billions would cheer. Millions would die. Moral clarity, Loki had learned, was a luxury of simple worlds. He made his choice in the dark, staring at a city that would never love him. He altered the summit, not by stopping it, but by redirecting it. When the doors closed and the presentation began, the screens didn't show what they were supposed to. Instead of sleek diagrams and patriotic slogans, they displayed projected outcomes, models Loki had built himself, simulations extrapolated from Vought's own data. Civil unrest curves, authoritarian drift, escalation spirals, a world where Aegis didn't save humanity, it ruled it. The room fell silent. "This is manipulation," a general barked. "No," Loki said, stepping into view at last. "Not glowing, not crowned, just present. This is consequence." Security moved. Loki let them. He didn't vanish, didn't fight. He stood and spoke while guns tracked his chest. "You are afraid of gods. You should be. Power without accountability is tyranny. But what you are building is not accountability. It is a monopoly on violence justified by fear. Someone shouted. Someone else listened. Loki felt the thin edge of belief return. Not worship, not awe, but attention earned. You don't need me, he finished. You need restraint, and you will not get it from men who profit from your terror. He disappeared then, not fleeing, but leaving them with themselves. The summit did not end Project Aegis, but it fractured it. Partners pulled out, oversight committees formed, leaks multiplied beyond Loki's control, the machine slowed. Homelanders snapped. The next time Loki felt him, it was like a scream across the city. They met on a rooftop at dawn, the sky bruised purple and gold. No cameras, no crowds, just two figures shaped by power and loneliness. You took everything, Homelander said, voice shaking. They don't look at me the same. Loki regarded him with something like pity. They never did. Homelander lunged. The fight was brutal and intimate. No spectacle, no illusions. Loki fought lean, precise, spending power like blood. Homelander fought desperate, unrestrained, a god terrified of becoming obsolete. Loki could have killed him. The opening was there, clean, final. Instead, Loki stepped back. You are not my responsibility, and neither is this world. Homelander froze, confusion cracking his rage. In that moment, he looked almost small. Loki vanished, leaving Homelander alone with the sunrise and the terrible realization that gods could walk away. From the shadows, Loki watched the city continue, messy, cruel, resilient. He was weaker than when he arrived, but he was freer. And for the first time in this universe, the lie was no longer uncontested.
The city was quieter than Loki expected. Not silent. There were sirens, traffic, angry shouts, but the constant hum of media frenzy had dulled. The story of the trickster god had been co-opted, reframed, minimized, and spun into forgettable headlines. Loki prank causes minor media disturbance. Internet troll sparks debate over soup oversight. Alleged god sightings debunked. Attention had drifted. That was the nature of this universe. What did not feed profit or outrage was irrelevant. Loki wandered through streets slick with rain, boots tapping softly against the asphalt. He observed the humans with their private wars, their private lies, their ambition mixed with desperation. It was a city of predators disguised as prey, and it pleased him more than he would admit. He had come here a god with theatrics and illusions, and now he was a god in subtlety, invisible, strategic, lethal in quiet. He found his allies in strange forms, the boys, ragged and determined, still moving against the system with knives, cameras, and cunning. Butcher had learned to value Loki not as a god, but as a resource, a planner who could anticipate Vought's every move. Huey, still haunted by the moral cost of fighting soups, followed Loki's instructions with reluctant trust. Mother's Milk coordinated leaks and safe houses, while Frenchie and Kimiko created diversions that were as theatrical as Loki's own illusions, but grounded, tangible, human. They orchestrated a strike that would shake the foundations of Vought without touching a single superhuman being directly. Loki's target? The supply chains, the misinformation networks, the corporate machinery that manufactured heroes like they were toys. He and the boys infiltrated data centers, swapped hard drives, and subtly altered algorithms. The aim was to reveal the machinery behind the myth without sparking mass panic. It required precision, patience, and restraint, all of which Loki had been honing for weeks. Meanwhile, Homelander observed from afar. He had recovered from their previous encounters and was furious, not at Loki exactly, but at the fact that someone, anyone, had shown him he was not in control. The public had stopped reacting purely to his theatrics.
Fear, his most reliable weapon, had become diluted, complicated by subtle truths that spread faster than he could intercept. He floated above skyscrapers, searching for Loki, burning with a mix of curiosity and rage, feeling powerless in a city that refused to kneel. Loki anticipated this. He left small, misleading traces of himself, a reflection in a window, a shadow slipping between camera angles, a whisper on the wind. Each was calculated to provoke but never to reveal, teasing Homelander into mistakes. And mistakes he made. He overreacted publicly, misjudged the boy's movements, and relied increasingly on technology instead of instinct. Loki noted every misstep. But as the weeks passed, Loki began to feel the strain of this world. Energy bled subtly from him when he manipulated infrastructure, dampened by interference fields that he could not fully counter. Unlike Asgard, where gods thrived on belief, here magic drained slowly, invisibly, attacks imposed by the human ingenuity of fear and oversight. Loki was forced to ration, to measure each spell, each illusion, each act of misdirection. Then came the morally complex choice, the one that would define his place in this world. A Vought laboratory, hidden under the guise of a charity hospital, housed dozens of children, some enhanced by Compound V, some normal, all experimental. The boys had discovered it and wanted to storm it, destroy the operation, and publicly expose the atrocities. Loki could easily have assisted. His magic could neutralize guards, sabotage systems, erase surveillance, and ensure no one survived the encounter. He could annihilate the lab and make it a public scandal that would destroy Vought's credibility.
But Loki hesitated. Killing the children, even accidentally, even for a greater cause, would stain him permanently. Even here, in a universe that celebrated pragmatism over morality, he was still Loki. He had learned restraint, the kind of discipline that makes legends, not monsters. Instead, Loki orchestrated a subtle revelation. He infiltrated the lab at night, walking invisibly past cameras and guards. He left evidence in digital and physical form, logs, research notes, security footage, and internal communications. He made sure everything could be discovered without harming a soul. Then, with a whisper of magic, he caused the laboratory systems to misfile themselves just long enough for investigative journalists aligned with the boys to access everything the next morning. The exposure was devastating, immediate, but not violent. The public outcry forced Vought to respond defensively, recalling executives, restructuring leadership, and spinning narratives to minimize damage. Homelander, furious, tore through a nearby skyscraper in frustration. But Loki had anticipated this and left a protective spell over civilians, ensuring no deaths. By the end of the week, the laboratory's secrets were public, and the world's perception of Supes began to fracture. People questioned the heroes they had worshipped blindly, the corporations they had trusted implicitly, and the moral cost of manufactured divinity. Vought scrambled to regain control, but Loki's strategic precision ensured they were always one step behind. Loki's moral choice of restraint, to destroy rather than display, to reveal rather than dominate, redefined his presence in this universe. He was no longer a god asserting supremacy. He was a trickster, a strategist, and a manipulator of information, wielding influence without bloodshed. He had found a new power, the ability to shift narratives, bend perception, and disrupt control without raising his hand. And yet, the strain on him was growing. Each manipulation drained more than magic. It consumed attention, patience, and energy. Loki realized he could not maintain this indefinitely. Unlike Asgard, this world's power dynamics were designed to wear down anyone who refused to play by its rules. He sought refuge in abandoned places, derelict theaters, unused subway tunnels, empty warehouses, and the occasional safe rooftop. Here he planned, reflected, and adapted.
But even in these spaces, the city pressed in. Technology, human ambition, and the slow, inexorable spread of corporate control. Homelander did not rest. He continued to hunt, to probe, to overextend. Each time he failed, his public image faltered subtly. People whispered about cracks in his perfection. Whispers became speculation. Speculation became doubt. Loki watched from the shadows, understanding that fear alone could not maintain control, and that exposure, even gentle exposure, was more dangerous than raw power. The boys remained critical allies. Butcher, ever pragmatic, began to understand the depth of Loki's strategy. He saw the value in subtlety, in information warfare, in manipulating systems rather than striking outward. Huey, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, and Kimiko executed Loki's plans with precision, each action reinforcing the impact of his guidance. Together, they became a network of influence that moved like a shadow through Vought's operations. Yet Loki knew he could not rely solely on them. Humans were unpredictable, unreliable, and emotional. They made mistakes, they revealed their strategies, they occasionally acted with moral rigidity that jeopardized plans. Loki had to intervene personally, calibrating outcomes with his own hand when necessary. Aegis units, once a looming threat, were neutralized through clever manipulation of their own tech. Surveillance feeds, once omnipresent, were fed misinformation. Contracts and legal documents were subtly altered to trigger internal audits and slowdowns. Loki became a silent conductor, orchestrating the fall of a corporate empire without ever stepping into the light. The morally complex choice of restraint defined him. He could have destroyed Supes, killed Homelander, or usurped control of Vought entirely, but doing so would have violated his own code, turning him into a god in a universe that did not respect gods. Instead, he chose influence, subtlety, and long-term disruption. By the time a month passed, Vought was reeling. Their leadership was fractured, the public's trust had eroded. Homelander, increasingly erratic, became a liability rather than a figure of power. Loki watched from the shadows as the corporate giants scrambled to survive, realizing that this universe's strength lay not in divine beings, but in perception, narrative, and control. And Loki had mastered it. He stood on a rooftop one evening, looking over Manhattan, the neon lights reflecting off wet streets like shards of broken promises. The city was still dangerous, Homelander was still powerful, Vought still controlled money, media, and manufactured heroes, but the cracks had begun. The machinery that sustained lies and fear had been infiltrated. The narrative could be bent, the illusion of invincibility shattered. For the first time, Loki allowed himself a smile, not the triumphant grin of a god, but the subtle curve of someone who understood the rules and had learned to play better than anyone else. This was not victory, not yet, but it was leverage, and leverage, Loki knew, was the currency of survival in a world that sold gods like commodities. He vanished once more, slipping between shadows and systems, unseen, untracked, unbound. He was no longer a spectacle, no longer a threat to be broadcast for ratings. He was a strategist, a manipulator of information, wielding influence without bloodshed. And in the quiet moments between plans, he allowed himself to reflect. This world was brutal, yes, merciless, yes, but it was also human, and humans could be swayed, guided, and bent toward outcomes without needing gods to intervene. Here, he had found a power greater than raw strength, the ability to influence without domination, to shape without ruling, to win without being worshipped. And as he looked towards the horizon, the first tendrils of dawn breaking over the skyscrapers, Loki realized that he had learned something essential. Gods may fall, legends may fade, but strategy, cunning, and subtlety endure. The city would continue to spin, full of ambition, greed, violence, and fragile hope. Supes would stumble, corporations would scheme, humans would lie, cheat, and fight. And Loki? He would be there, always watching, always guiding, always moving the pieces in a game that no one else even knew they were playing. For the first time in a long while, Loki felt not the thrill of chaos, but the satisfaction of mastery. And in a universe that feared gods, the trickster learned that being unseen was sometimes far more powerful than being worshipped.
Weeks turned into months, and Loki's presence became a whispered certainty rather than a spectacle. He existed in the cracks between corporate power and human ambition, in the spaces where decisions were made but never broadcast. He learned the architecture of this world in astonishing detail, how Vought manipulated public opinion, how Soup's reputations were curated, and how fear, spectacle, and narrative intertwined to form an unbreakable feedback loop. The city itself, ever indifferent to gods, became a living board game, and Loki, at last, was playing it with precision. Loki's operations were meticulous. He infiltrated financial institutions, subtly redirecting funds that supported Vought's clandestine projects. He seeded documents that suggested mismanagement, prompting internal audits that slowed Aegis deployment. Social media campaigns he orchestrated made the public question Soup's authority, highlighting minor scandals with surgical precision to amplify public doubt. Each move was calculated to create systemic instability without overt violence, a campaign of information and perception that chipped away at the facade of invulnerability surrounding Vought and its creations. Billy Butcher, ever the pragmatist, had adapted to Loki's methods, though not without friction. "This is like watching paint dry while someone shoots fire from their fingers," Butcher muttered one evening as they surveilled a Vought logistics hub from a derelict rooftop. "It's slow, messy, and I bloody hate it, but it's working." Loki smiled faintly, sipping a bitter drink that was human in form. "Patience is often more lethal than anger, Butcher," he replied, "and in a world built on spectacle, subtlety is invisible death." Huey, tense and nervous as always, tracked public reaction in real time. "People are talking, but it feels like they're still scared of Homelander," he said. "Even with everything you've done, the fear's still there." "That's the point, Huey." Loki scanned city lights. "Fear is a tool, Huey, not the goal. If you mistake the tremor for the earthquake, you will act too early and destroy yourself." Meanwhile, Homelander's control frayed, slowly, imperceptibly. The public's adoration wavered. His heroic persona was questioned as evidence of corruption and recklessness emerged from leaks orchestrated by Loki. Each failure forced him to act, overcompensate, and make mistakes that were then subtly amplified by the trickster's careful orchestration. Homelander grew desperate, increasingly reckless, and more prone to errors that exposed his vulnerabilities. Loki watched this unfold with fascination. He was no longer confronting Homelander head-on, but manipulating the environment so that Homelander became his own undoing. A poorly timed public appearance, a mismanaged rescue operation, a carefully leaked recording showing him harming civilians under duress. Each incident was small in isolation, but when layered, became an unstoppable tide of doubt. But it wasn't just Homelander who was affected. Vought executives, reliant on perfection and control, were now scrambling to maintain the illusion of omnipotence. They moved like pawns forced to adapt to an invisible opponent they could not see or predict. Loki found a certain poetic justice in watching humans, long the masters of deception and narrative, struggle when someone else controlled the strings with elegance and patience. In the shadows, Loki also had to navigate morally gray terrain. Children had been experimented on, adults had been misled, and innocent people remained at risk. He could not destroy the system outright. Doing so would kill too many and compromise his strategic advantage. Instead, he orchestrated exposures that caused disruption and accountability without fatalities, forcing Vought to adapt or risk irrelevance. It was a delicate balance, and one he maintained with rigorous discipline. One night, he met Butcher on a rooftop overlooking the river. "You've changed," Butcher said. voice carrying over the distant hum of traffic. "You're not the god who walks in and smashes everything. You're a planner, a manipulator." "And what is that if not power?" Loki asked, voice low, reflective. "The ability to shape outcomes without direct confrontation is the greatest dominion of all." Butcher shook his head. "It's cunning, dangerous, sure, but cold, and I don't know if you're cold enough." Loki smiled faintly. "Perhaps I am not, Butcher. Or perhaps I am learning the wrong lesson for the right universe. Here, even gods must compromise, or they die slowly in the shadows." Meanwhile, Homelander's instability reached a new level. The man who once demanded absolute control began making unpredictable decisions. Loki anticipated these, yet he also began to exploit the cracks in Homelander's morality, nudging him into choices that further eroded public trust. The superhero, who had once been untouchable, was now a liability, an unpredictable element that Loki's strategies transformed from a threat into a tool of systemic collapse. But the morally complex challenge persisted. Loki had to navigate his own ethical boundaries. He was capable of outright annihilation, but chose to limit collateral damage, operating on the principle that the ends did not justify indiscriminate destruction. Each exposure, each disruption was surgical, designed to achieve maximum systemic effect with minimal loss of life. This approach reinforced his new identity in the boy's universe, a god of strategy rather than spectacle, a master of consequence rather than chaos. By the third month, Vought's internal cohesion was visibly deteriorating. Executives no longer coordinated seamlessly. Field operations faltered under pressure. Leaks and subtle sabotage had forced the company into reactive mode. Homelander's public appearances grew erratic, revealing his unpredictability to an audience that once viewed him as flawless. Even minor supes began questioning loyalty to Vought, emboldened by subtle hints of exposure and the unraveling narrative of omnipotence orchestrated by Loki. Loki remained unseen in the public eye, a ghost manipulating perception, but he was everywhere in the systems. Every exposure, every disruption, every misdirected operation was part of a larger strategy, deconstructing a universe that worshipped false gods and manufactured heroes without ever lifting a sword in rage. Finally, a confrontation approached, not physical, but symbolic. A media summit meant to reassert Vought's control coincided with subtle leaks curated by Loki. Executives attempted unity, Homelander attempted heroism, but the audience, guided by Loki's careful manipulations, questioned every word, every gesture. The illusion of invincibility cracked. The corporation's narrative began to fail publicly, not because of force, but because perception, attention, and belief had been redirected with surgical precision. Loki watched from an undisclosed location, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. He had learned that in this universe, gods were less powerful than information, less feared than perception, and less enduring than strategy. By operating in the shadows, exploiting human systems, and applying moral restraint, he had created a long-term plan that destabilized power structures without mass casualties, a feat far more satisfying than mere destruction.
As night fell over Manhattan, Loki reflected on the moral calculus he had developed. He could have ruled, could have destroyed, could have been worshipped, or feared. Instead, he chose influence, subtlety, and the slow erosion of power. He had become less a god and more a strategist, a trickster who understood that the greatest victories were often invisible. In the distance, Homelander roared in frustration. The boys moved carefully against remaining Vought operations, and the city continued to turn, ignorant of the invisible hand that guided outcomes. Loki stood on a rooftop, watching the interplay of fear, ambition, and morality. He had lost the omnipotence he once wielded freely, but he had gained something more profound: control through invisibility, mastery through manipulation, and the power to shape a universe that rejected gods. For Loki, the city was no longer a playground for divine theatrics. It was a board of strategy, a puzzle of human will, and he was its unseen master. The first hint that Loki's campaign had shifted the balance of power came not from humans, nor from Homelander, nor even from Vought itself. It came from the small, unremarkable data feed buried in the back channels of social media analytics. Subtle shifts, at first imperceptible, the public's perception of Supes had decreased by fractions of a percent each day. Aegis operations faltered as internal audits flagged inconsistencies. Local authorities began questioning previously unquestioned directives. Even Vought's media machines struggled to maintain coherence, misaligning messaging across regions. The machine was cracking, not from force, but from careful, precise manipulation of information, orchestrated entirely by Loki. He watched it unfold from a nondescript apartment several blocks from Times Square, drinking black coffee and adjusting systems remotely. The boys were spread across the city, executing minor interventions that reinforced his strategy. Butcher coordinated leaks and diversions. Huey monitored public response. Mother's Milk managed safe houses for insiders and whistleblowers. Frenchie and Kimiko executed targeted sabotage to Vought's physical infrastructure. Every action was calculated, synchronized, and invisible to the general public. Loki leaned back, eyes scanning a live map of network activity. He could see Homelander moving through the city, increasingly frantic, reacting to misalignments he could not comprehend. Each misstep was amplified by the environment, a domino effect Loki had engineered carefully. He could have confronted Homelander directly, could have exposed him on a global scale, could have ended the man's influence entirely, but he did not. The moral complexity weighed on him. Violence was easy, influence was difficult. Precision, discipline, patience, it was all harder than striking with magic or tearing a man apart physically. Yet it was more lasting. A universe could recover from destruction, but a world whose perception of power had been rewritten would never return to its old illusions. Then came the summit. Vought had organized a closed-door event to reassert control, gather investors, and display Supes as untouchable. Loki had infiltrated weeks prior, planting subtle misinformation and surveillance gaps. The event's security, precision-engineered to detect and neutralize Supes, inadvertently played into Loki's hands. Drones misread threats, cameras misaligned, and the digital infrastructure rerouted sensitive information into channels the boys controlled. Inside the summit, executives delivered speeches designed to inspire confidence, while Homelander posed as the ultimate savior. Every statement, every gesture, every projection had been pre-calibrated by Loki to expose inconsistencies. Graphs contradicted previous releases, figures were off by imperceptible but critical margins, and internal communications leaked live to investigative journalists already in position.
Homelander noticed something was off. His expression twisted, a mask of rage and confusion. He attempted to reassert dominance, flexing and displaying feats of strength, but each display only drew attention to the inconsistencies Loki had sown. The public perception, though filtered, began to crack. Loki observed, invisible, from a maintenance corridor above the auditorium. He could feel the city's attention bending subtly toward truth, the illusion of invincibility unraveling piece by piece. He allowed himself a smile, faint, careful, human. He was not a god here. He was something better, a strategist, shaping events without detection. The critical moment came when Homelander, desperate to regain control, acted impulsively. He targeted a journalist broadcasting live coverage, intending to intimidate, but Loki, anticipating the move, had already manipulated security systems and digital feeds so that the act was not witnessed as intended. Instead, it appeared to the public as a misfire, a minor error, an example of human fallibility. This misstep shattered the narrative Homelander had relied on for decades. Fear, once absolute, was diluted. Confidence, once unwavering, wavered. Public perception shifted from awe to scrutiny. Every subsequent action Homelander took was now filtered through doubt, magnifying mistakes rather than achievements. Loki, from his vantage point, allowed the moral weight of his choices to settle. He could have escalated, attacked, dominated, but he chose long-term disruption over immediate gratification, influence over violence, strategy over chaos. This universe did not require gods to intervene physically. It required a subtle hand to guide perception, orchestrate exposure, and manipulate systems. The summit ended in confusion. Executives scrambled to control the narrative. Homelander left in a storm of public skepticism, his power intact, but his influence fractured. Aegis protocols, now subtly misaligned and exposed, faltered in their execution across multiple sites. Vought's internal cohesion began to crumble. Loki retreated to his safe space, considering the broader implications. The moral complexity of his choices weighed on him. He had disrupted a system without causing mass casualties, reshaped public perception, and exposed corruption. Yet, the world remained dangerous. Soups still existed, corporations still schemed, humans remained unpredictable. But the balance had shifted.
The boys, briefed post-summit, recognized the subtle genius of Loki's approach. "You've turned their strength into weakness," Butcher said, voice low, respectful. "I didn't think it could be done without blood." "That is precisely the point," Loki replied, voice measured. "Violence is easy. Persuasion, subversion, patience, these endure. This is a world that fears gods. Let it learn the cost of underestimating strategy." Homelander, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. His public persona remained superficially intact, but the cracks were widening. He became reactive, unpredictable, and vulnerable to exposure. Loki had not defeated him physically, but the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Influence, perception, and subtle manipulation had trumped brute force. In the quiet aftermath, Loki allowed himself reflection. He had abandoned overt godhood, operated entirely through strategy and influence, and achieved results that raw power could not accomplish. He had maintained moral restraint, minimized collateral damage, and reshaped the perception of Soups and Vought without firing a single fatal shot. He had become invisible yet indispensable, feared yet unseen, powerful not because of divine might, but because of understanding, calculation, and foresight. As night fell over the city, Loki stood on a rooftop overlooking the skyline, watching lights flicker like living neurons across a sleeping organism. Soups were still there, corporations still scheming, humans still striving, but the narrative had changed. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Influence had triumphed over spectacle. And Loki, once a god among men, had discovered something far more potent than worship, the ability to guide the course of events invisibly, with patience, strategy, and subtlety, a power this universe both feared and unknowingly revered. The city had changed. Not overnight, not in a way that could be measured by headlines or applause, but in a subtle, pervasive way that shifted power from spectacle to consequence. Loki observed from the rooftops, a ghost among the neon and steel, understanding that the world he had entered was not a place where gods could rule openly. Influence, perception, and information were the new divinity, and Loki had become its silent master. He had transformed from the flamboyant trickster god who delighted in chaos and spectacle into something more refined, a strategist whose interventions shaped outcomes without leaving immediate traces. Every move had been calculated, every leak, every misdirection, every subtle sabotage of Vought's operations had been orchestrated to weaken the illusion of control Soups wielded over humanity, and it had worked. The boys had adapted to this new paradigm. Butcher moved with precision, no longer reliant solely on brute force. Huey in Mother's Milk coordinated intelligence, mapping Vought's influence across bureaucracies, social networks, and military installations. Frenchie in Kimiko executed the tactical strikes Loki had devised, each action invisible to the public eye, but devastatingly effective. Together, they formed an unseen network of influence that rivaled the power of any soup. Loki's moral complexity had reached its apex during the operation to expose Vought's hidden laboratory experiments. Children had been experimented upon, and although he could have destroyed the facility outright, he had chosen to preserve life while ensuring the evidence reached the right channels. The revelation rocked public confidence in Vought and in the soups, creating systemic disruption without creating martyrs or unnecessary casualties. Homelander, once untouchable and omnipotent in perception, had begun to falter. Each mistake he made, each poorly timed heroic display, each mismanaged public event had been amplified subtly by Loki's interventions. The world began to see cracks where previously there were none. Doubt, scrutiny, and hesitation began to erode the facade of invincibility, transforming fear into cautious observation. Loki's strategy was not without personal cost. Operating in a world that diminished gods, that drained magical energy through interference and disbelief, had left him weaker in a way that Asgardian battles never could. Each spell, each illusion, each manipulation consumed him subtly, taxing his body and mind. Yet he persisted, understanding that his true power lay not in raw magic, but in guiding perception, shaping decisions, and orchestrating outcomes. The culmination of Loki's efforts approached during a citywide crisis designed by Vought to reassert control, a demonstration of new soup technologies intended to showcase invincibility and restore public faith. Loki had already infiltrated the event's security systems and communications infrastructure. Every camera, microphone, and drone had been subtly manipulated. Every document, every speech, every presentation had been pre-checked for inconsistencies that could be amplified to maximum effect. The event began. Executives delivered speeches, promising renewed safety and heroism. Soups performed with calculated precision. Homelander, desperate to assert dominance, moved through the crowd, flexing his perceived invincibility. But as intended, subtle disruptions unfolded. Minor inconsistencies, misaligned projections, and carefully leaked information created doubt among observers. The illusion of perfection faltered. The public noticed errors that were previously invisible. The perception of control weakened. Loki, watching from the shadows, allowed a faint smile. The moral calculus was clear. He could have struck directly, exposed Homelander fully, destroyed the summit in spectacular fashion, but that would have caused unnecessary casualties and potentially incited chaos beyond his control. Instead, he orchestrated systemic failure through perception and information, a strategy far more enduring than mere destruction.
The summit ended in confusion. Executives scrambled to regain control, media outlets struggled to spin the narrative, and Homelander left visibly shaken, unable to fully reclaim public trust. The city itself had witnessed a subtle shift. The myth of invulnerability had been undermined without mass violence, without spectacle, and without the public fully understanding who or what was responsible. Loki's final confrontation with Homelander occurred not in battle, but in symbolic presence. The two met atop a skyscraper at dawn, the skyline glowing in muted golds and purples. No cameras, no spectators, just the raw tension of two beings measuring power. Homelander's rage radiated in palpable waves, but Loki remained calm, a steady figure whose strength lay not in physical might, but in understanding, patience, and foresight. "You've changed everything," Homelander hissed, voice trembling. "The world doesn't fear me the same way. They're questioning, and it's your fault." They were already questioning. I merely gave them the tools to see clearly. Power unchallenged becomes tyranny. Fear unchecked becomes obsession. You are mortal, Homelander, in the most important ways. Homelander lunged, a desperate attempt to assert dominance, but Loki evaded with minimal effort, relying not on strength but on anticipation in the environment itself. Every misstep Homelander made was a reflection of the strategic web Loki had spun. A battle, in the traditional sense, was unnecessary. Perception and consequence were already winning. When the confrontation ended, Loki disappeared, leaving Homelander alone with the city and the dawning realization that he was no longer the untouchable apex predator he had believed himself to be. Power remained in his hands, but influence, the subtle shaping of narrative, perception, and systemic control, had shifted irreversibly. Loki, invisible and unbound, observed the city as the sun rose. Vought was fractured, Homelander's image tarnished, and the soup's influence diminished. The boys remained vigilant, executing follow-up operations that reinforced the shift in balance. The world was still dangerous, full of ambition, corruption, and unpredictability, but the game had changed. And Loki, once a god defined by spectacle and chaos, had learned something far more potent. Strategy, subtlety, and moral restraint could reshape a universe in ways brute force never could. He had become a master not of destruction, but of consequence, a figure whose influence would endure invisibly, guiding outcomes, shaping perceptions, and reminding a world that gods could exist in shadow, unseen, but immeasurably powerful. As night fell over the skyline, Loki allowed himself the rare indulgence of reflection. He had entered this universe as a god out of place, unchallenged only by circumstance. He had adapted, learned, and ultimately prevailed not through raw strength, but through cunning, patience, and moral judgment. The city would continue to spin, humans would continue to fight, corporations would continue to scheme, but the balance had shifted, the narrative had been rewritten. In this universe, gods were not worshipped, they were calculated, anticipated, and, when necessary, undermined. Loki had discovered a new form of power, one that was quieter, subtler, and ultimately more enduring than any display of brute force. He vanished into the shadows, the trickster no longer defined by spectacle, but by mastery, strategy, and the unseen hand of influence. Loki's journey through the boys' universe had transformed him in ways even he had not anticipated. He had arrived as a god of chaos and mischief, relying on spectacle, illusions, and raw power to command attention. But this world was different, brutal, pragmatic, and indifferent to divinity. Humans worshipped convenience, corporations manipulated narratives, and fear was traded like currency. Gods who acted with grandeur were either co-opted, neutralized, or ignored. In order to survive and ultimately influence outcomes, Loki had to abandon overt displays of power and embrace strategy, subtlety, and patient manipulation. Through months of carefully orchestrated operations, he had destabilized Vought, exposed corruption, and shifted public perception without relying on direct violence. He had transformed raw fear into calculated doubt, turning Homelander's myth of invincibility into vulnerability. The Supes, once untouchable, now operated under scrutiny, their mistakes amplified by the invisible hand guiding events behind the scenes. Even the corporate empire of Vought, built to manufacture heroes and command obedience, had begun to crumble under the weight of truth and perception, carefully steered by Loki's interventions. Yet his victories were not absolute. The world remained dangerous and unpredictable, full of ambition, corruption, and moral compromise. Loki had chosen restraint over destruction, influence over domination, and consequence over spectacle, decisions that reinforced his moral complexity and cemented his transformation. He had learned that power alone did not guarantee control, and that enduring impact came from shaping perceptions, guiding decisions, and orchestrating outcomes invisibly.
By the story's end, Loki was no longer a god in the traditional sense. He was a master strategist, a trickster operating in the shadows, and a force capable of reshaping a universe without being worshipped or feared openly. His presence remained invisible to the public eye, but his influence was undeniable. The boys had gained a powerful ally, humanity had glimpsed cracks in their illusions, and the Supes, powerful yet fallible, were reminded that even gods could be outmaneuvered. The thematic resonance of Loki's journey was clear. True power lies not in raw strength, but in foresight, subtlety, and moral calculation. A world built on spectacle could be shifted by quiet intelligence. A system that worshipped fear could be undermined by patience. A universe that relied on belief could be swayed by strategy. Loki's tale reminded that in even the most brutal and indifferent worlds, the unseen hand often shapes destiny more than the mightiest of gods. And as he vanished once more into the city's labyrinthian streets, the trickster knew that his work was far from over. The game had changed, the balance had shifted, and the universe would continue to turn. But now, Loki moved the pieces. More stories awaits.